My name is Dennis Cooley, and I want to welcome everybody for coming to the Science Religion Lunch Seminar at NDSU, sort of. Again, this is a Zoom online. And the Science Religion Lunch Seminar was founded by Davis Cope, and when he retired, it was turned over to the NPEI to continue. We've been doing it for a year or two, and this particular year, we've been interspersing them with another series on race and racism. In fall, we hope to be able to have these every other week. So what we need to be able to do that, of course, are proposals for it. So if any of you are interested in giving a talk for Science Religion Lunch, it could be on science, it could be on religion, lunch, or a combination of any of the three, then please send your proposal to ndsu.npei, the NPEI, at ndsu.edu. But to more important things, I want to thank Scott Forsler, our last Science Religion Lunch presenter, on his talk on determinism and free will. That was March 9th. I also want to give a plug-in for Ann Denton, NDSU Department of Computer Science. She's going to be giving a talk for us May 4th at 12 p.m. Paradoxes between science and morality. So we will also send out an announcement of that. But to the main event today, Ahmed Afzaal is an associate professor in the religion department at Concordia College. He holds a PhD in religion and society from Drew University in Madison, New Jersey. Ahmed has a wide range of interests and is passionate about lifelong learning, values-based action, and collaboration for the greater good. And he was kind enough to be willing to give us a talk on the introduction to Prosocial. So I'm going to turn it over to Ahmed.
All right, well, thank you very much. And thank you. I first heard about Prosocial in the summer of 2019. And the more I looked into it, the more I liked what I saw. And so I'm here today because I just want to share this treasure with as many people as I can. So the challenge that I've set up for myself is to speak for about 30 minutes, roughly, and to convince you within that time that learning the theory and practice of prosocial is going to be worth your time and effort. And let me start by telling you something that you already know, even if you have never thought about it consciously. There's something not quite right with the way we have organized our society. Now, I'm not saying that there is nothing good or true or beautiful about how our society functions, because such a claim would be wrong, as such a society cannot even exist. What I am saying is that there is a sort of crookedness or a misalignment, a pathology, somewhere deep within the foundations of our social systems and structures. Here's what I mean. Much of our society is organized in a way that makes us live and act in ways that are against our true nature and our innate dispositions. No wonder we are so stressed all the time, so depressed and so anxious. And no wonder that we don't feel at home. We don't feel at home because we are in a state of exile. We feel that way because we live and act, for the most part, in ways that don't bring us joy and satisfaction. And that's not just an individual problem that we can solve with therapy. It's a collective problem, so much so that we think of it not even as a problem, but as part of the human condition. I'm here to tell you that it is not inevitable. It is the result of how we have designed our social institutions, systems, and structures. So we are in a state of exile, but the good news here is that we are not lost. We know where the home is, and we have access to many pathways that can take us from where we are to where we need to be. And prosocial is one of those pathways. But first, I want us to look at our current predicament, our state of exile. Now, there's one way to start this, one way to introduce The issue is to talk about human nature. As we know, there's a long-standing debate about human nature, which asks the following questions. What kind of creatures are we? Are we like this, or are we like that? Are human beings naturally aggressive or naturally compassionate? Are we inherently selfish or inherently cooperative? Are we greedy or generous? Wicked or virtuous? Corrupt or wholesome? Now, the binary choice you may find problematic. You might say, well, we are some combination of both. And to some extent, I would agree. We are capable of both types of behaviors. Human beings can commit extreme acts of violence and cruelty, but we are also capable of extreme acts of kindness and generosity and sacrifice. But then again, that's not what the debate is about. The debate is about which of these two sides in the debate represents our inner, our nature, our essential nature, our innate disposition, our true home. Now, regardless of whether or not you have thought about this issue, the fact is that all of us are carrying in our minds certain assumptions about human nature. And these assumptions are implicated in how we live and act in the world. We have these assumptions because while the debate goes on, we have to live and act in the world, which means we have to interact with other people. And interacting with other people requires at least a working hypothesis about the sort of creatures we are dealing with. So in the process of growing up, we acquire a set of assumptions about human nature, about who we are as a species. Now, these assumptions tend to vary from one society to another, but within any given society, they have a habit of being, they tend to persist over time. That's because they are an element of culture. And like other elements of culture, they are transmitted from one generation to another. Such assumptions are part of the conventional wisdom. They are part of what a culture considers common sense. Now, despite the fact that human beings are capable of both sorts of behaviors, it so happens that our culture has, on the whole, for the most part, chosen the left-hand side of the debate over the right-hand side. We know this because a great deal of how our social systems and institutions function would make sense only if we assume a dark and pessimistic view of human nature. This view of who we are justifies coercive, punitive, and hierarchical structures. We believe that if we are left to our own devices, we would do horrible things to each other. And so we accept the necessity of coercion. We believe that children are born rebellious and they have to be socialized into civilized people. And for that to happen, we are willing to use shame and guilt and fear. We believe that our justice system has to be based on punishment, again, for the same reason. We think that violence, the only right response to violence is more violence. That is why our institutions are organized hierarchically. Even our democracy is under significant constraints. And we think that all social problems ought to be solved through laws and regulations, as if legislation can change things. Now, there have always been people who did not agree with this dark and pessimistic view of human nature, that we are greedy, selfish, competitive, individualistic, wicked, prone toward corruption. And all of this is there by nature. And so they tried arguing against this view, and they tried to present a more positive, optimistic picture of who we are as a species. In the past, it was often possible to ignore these voices, but not anymore. And that's because scientists from a variety of disciplines have been looking into this issue for a while. And about 20 years ago, their cumulative findings reached a sort of tipping point. So as a result, the debate over human nature is coming to an end. The tide is turning, the story is changing, and that's because we now have a much more evidence-based understanding of the kind of creatures we are. The emerging view is incredibly positive. It gives us very good reasons to feel optimistic about improving human behavior. There is a virtual flood of both academic books and popular books on this subject, and all of them are telling us that our society's conventional wisdom about human nature, the view that underlies much of our social systems and institutions, is seriously flawed. Aggression, competition, selfishness, greed, these are not inscribed in our genes or hardwired into our brains. The exact opposite is true. Now, this shift that's going on has implications for all of us. If our culture's basic understanding of who we are as a species is wrong, then it means that all those aspects of our social systems and institutions that we have built on the basis of that understanding are also seriously flawed. That's precisely why we don't feel at home. We don't feel at home because our world is organized in a way that requires us to live and act against our innate dispositions and our true nature. That's what I mean when I say we are in a state of exile. So what should we do? I don't think that we should try to adapt ourselves to this upside down world so that we can better fit into it. What we ought to do is to try and put the world right side up so that it comes into alignment with who we are, with the kind of creatures we are. Once we realize that, we understand that business as usual cannot continue. There's this challenge that faces us, which is that we must transform our social systems and institutions in fundamental ways. And that's going to involve a shift from top-down hierarchical structures to those based on participation and cooperation. Now, this sounds like a difficult task, and it is, but I want to remind you that I already gave you the good news. We are in exile, but we are not lost. We know where the home is. And we also have access to many, many pathways that can take us from where we are to where we belong. So here are a few examples of some of these pathways. Prosocial is one of these pathways. Now, the best way to introduce prosocial is through an exercise. So I'm going to ask you to do that exercise with me. And the way it is done is you're going to need a pen and paper, or you can use your computer, or you can use a phone. Basically, the exercise requires you to think about a group to which you currently belong. This cannot be a casual group of friends, such as a book club. Think of a group that is trying to achieve a goal or complete a task or serve a mission. It can be a work-related group, such as a committee, a team, a department. It can also be in the context of a voluntary association, such as the local chapter of a political party, the executive committee in a church. Now, once you have in mind a group to which you currently belong, I'm going to ask you to evaluate that group on a number of criteria. I'm going to give you a list of characteristics of an ideal group. And to make that interesting, I'm going to say, well, rate your group on each of these characteristics on a scale of 1 to 10. Or I should say 0 to 10. If you find that there's a characteristic which is entirely absent from your group, then you give it a 0. If it's minimally present, you might give it 1 or 2 or 3. If it is present to the maximum extent possible, give it a 10. And at the end, we can tally that up and you can give your group a grade. We'll see what it gets. And it's fine if this, if this feels like very subjective, that is perfectly fine. So I'm assuming that this makes sense. Can the company you work in be a group? Sure. But I would suggest think of a smaller subdivision within your company. So 6 to 12 people. Even large companies, large organizations have smaller groups or teams. And so that's what I'd like you to think about. And this is because that would be the group that you're most familiar with. So people that you work most often who are in the closest proximity. That may not be the entire company. That may be just a small team. So think of that. Now we are imagining an ideal group. And an ideal group's first characteristic is that members of this group fully understand what the purpose is, and they find it worthy of their time and effort. The group is a strong source of their identity, and there is pride in belonging to that group. There's joy in working together. So think of your group, evaluate your group on this criterion, and assign it a number. Now, by definition, the ideal group always gets 10 out of 10. Your group will get, it may get 10 out of 10, or it may get a different score. The second characteristic is this. Members of this group agree that the balance between what they give and what they receive is fair and acceptable. There is no exploitation or free riding. No one takes advantage of anyone else. So that is the second characteristic. Moving on to the third one. All members of this group are involved in the making of any decisions that affect them, especially the decisions about how decisions are made. Everyone knows that their values, concerns, and interests matter. Fourth characteristic, members of this group notice and care about each other's behavior. Everyone in the group is aware of what others are doing. Transparency in this group is highly valued. All relevant information is regularly shared. The fifth characteristic is that group members provide feedback to each other. How do they provide feedback? They respond to each other's behavior. How do they respond? They distinguish between helpful behavior and unhelpful behavior. The group applies appropriate sanctions for unhelpful behavior. There are consequences for acting in ways that go against the purpose of the group. And the consequences are appropriate to the nature of the action in question. But in the same way, helpful behavior is recognized and celebrated. Next is characteristic number 6, which is that this group recognizes the inevitability of conflict. In any collective endeavor, there are going to be disagreements, and some disagreements can escalate into conflicts. And for that reason, this group has established specific procedures for equitable and effective resolution of internal conflicts. Conflicts in this group are not allowed to simmer for a long time. They are quickly, effectively, and equitably resolved. The processes and procedures have been put into place for that to happen. And moreover, everyone is encouraged to express if they have any grievances. The seventh characteristic of the ideal group is that the group enjoys sufficient autonomy to manage its own affairs. And sufficient here is in accordance with the nature and purpose of and the size of the group, obviously. And what this means is that the group can manage its own affairs without being constrained by excessive interference from external authorities, meaning people outside the group controlling or dictating. That would go against this characteristic. One more. The ideal characteristic number 8. This group is concerned not just with advancing its own interests, but it also wants to support the interests of other groups, including the interests of the larger groups to which it belongs. And that's because the group recognizes that all groups are interdependent. And it recognizes that every group is nested within larger groups. And on the basis of that recognition, this group seeks to establish collaborative and equitable relationships with other groups. You can add up your the scores you gave your group and see what grade it gets. It is extremely rare for a group to get an A. A few groups would get F. Most probably get a C or a D, I think. If what A means is that your group is highly functional. It's highly collaborative. It's a source of identity and joy, and everything goes perfectly. Even when there's a conflict, things run a predictable course. And if your group got an A, I would like to see it, just to admire it. These 8 characteristics that I listed, these are called core design principles, or CDPs. And the purpose of Prosocial is to help any group, a team, organization, community, to implement these principles and thereby move the group from wherever it is to as close to the ideal group as humanly possible. And that's what these are called, CDPs. There's a limited finite number of principles. They have their own names, but I've already explained what they mean. A group that has all of these characteristics is a prosocial group. And the group that lacks some or more is to that extent dysfunctional. All right, so in the remaining time, what I would like to do is very quickly introduce you to what Prosocial is, what its purpose is. So what its purpose is to help any group or team or organization to become more equitable, increase its fairness and equity, to become more collaborative, to increase the overall effectiveness, and to improve the well-being of the individual members. That's the outcome, and the way to achieve that is by implementing those core design principles. So Prosocial is both a conceptual framework and it is a practical program. Where did it come from? Prosocial comes from a synthesis of 3 different research streams. I would love to talk about the science, but I don't want to take up all the time. So what I'm going to do is just mention what these research streams are, and we can discuss more of that in the Q&A. So research stream number 1 is coming to us from evolutionary science. Especially, it deals with the multi-level selection theory and applied cultural evolution. The most important research that's been done is in this area is by David Sloan Wilson. The second research stream is coming to us from behavioral science. And here we are looking at relational frame theory and acceptance and commitment therapy or training, also known as ACT. The most important research in this area has been done by Stephen Hayes. The third research stream is coming to us from social science. Specifically, it has to do with core design principles. And these principles have been discovered in the course of research on common pool resource management. And the most important research in that area has been done by Eleanor Ostrom. So what happens when you bring these 3 research streams together, evolutionary science, behavioral science, social science, and you put these people in conversation with each other? Well, what you get is a scientifically grounded conceptual framework that tells us exactly how we can evolve the culture of a group by helping its members increase their psychological flexibility so they can align their behavior with the core design principles necessary for maximizing collaboration. That is Prosocial as a conceptual framework. But then what happens if you ask an organizational psychologist, in this case, Paul Atkins, to join the conversation and help apply this theory in real life situations? What you get is a comprehensive yet practical and flexible program for creating productive, equitable, and collaborative groups. So in this way, Prosocial works as a conceptual framework. So if you're interested in theory, that's what is going to appeal most to you. But not everybody needs to understand the theory, because the real meat is in its implementation, and that's a practical program. Prosocial is not a management fad. I think of it as one of the many ways that we have at our disposal to escape our state of exile. Prosocial is not the only way to go from where we are to where we need to be, but it is one of those ways. And what's remarkable about Prosocial is that both its theory and its practice are grounded in empirical science. So I'm going to stop at this point, and we can look at questions or comments.
There's a chat or a question from Davis Cope in the chat. Davis, do you want to ask the question, or do you just? So Davis's question, does the book Prosocial give the CDPs?
Yes. The book Prosocial has a chapter dedicated to each of these core design principles.
I've got a question. When you were thinking about these groups, I thought of a group I'm in that's smaller, and then the bigger group it's part of was a different outcome. So the smaller group was very high ranked on those numbers, and the bigger group wasn't. What does that tell you? Am I doing something wrong?
Like whether you're evaluating the group right or wrong?
Right. Is it possible to have something like this where you have smaller groups that are really highly functioning, but the larger group isn't working as well?
Right.
What does that tell you?
Well, what we are looking at is the culture of a group, and culture is a local phenomenon. And so this is perfectly possible, and it's common, in fact, that you have a larger group that functions well or badly, and then it has nested within it, there are smaller groups, and some of them are functioning well, and some of them are not. Ideally, of course, we want the smaller groups to function well, and we also want the smaller groups to function well with each other, so that the larger groups functions to its maximum capacity. Sometimes, so a group can score very high on most of these criteria, but it may not score very high on the last one, which is its relationships with other groups. And so that's why you can have very good groups, but when you put them together, the total outcome is disappointing. And that's because the groups are not collaborating, coordinating, cooperating as well as they can be. It's just like saying that you can have a group of people in which each individual person is highly competent. And yet, if those individual people are not able to work well with each other, the group as a whole is going to be ineffective. The same principle applies when you're dealing with groups, multiple groups that are part of a larger group.
Thanks. And are there other questions? You could put them in chat, or you could unmute and ask the question. If not, I'll ask another one because I'm interested in how this works. So take my example, the small group and the big groups. How do we get the big group to act like the smaller group? Do you have any recommendations?
Right. So I can tell you how the theory goes. This is based on multi-level selection theory, and it comes from evolutionary science. So in evolutionary science, it was believed for a long time that the unit of selection is the individual organism. The thinking now, the theory towards which the field is moving is multi-level selection. What that means is that evolution happens not only at the level of the individual, but also at the level of the group. And because groups are often organized hierarchically, and by hierarchy, I mean as they're nested within each other. So think of a family, a number of families. So start with a small group called family. Put those groups, a number of different families will form a clan. A number of different clans will form a tribe. A number of different tribes might form a nation or something. Or you can think in terms of individual households, and then neighborhoods, then cities, then states, then countries. So these are hierarchically nested groups. Now, if evolution happens at all of those levels, you want to ask, is it going to create selfish organisms, selfish groups, selfish people, or is it going to create cooperative groups? The answer is, it all depends on the balance of of the selection pressure. When the selection pressure is working more at the individual level, you're going to get more and more selfishness. When it acts at the level of the group, such as the family, you're going to get more collaboration. But remember, there's multi-level. So the pressure, the selection pressure acting at family level, yes, is going to create families that are intensely collaborative. But selection pressure also acts at the next high level up, which is the level of clans. If there is competition among families, then you're going to get families that are internally highly collaborative, but they cannot work with other families. Same thing will happen at the level of clan and tribe. A tribe that consists of clans, and those clans are highly competitive with each other, this will result in high collaboration inside each clan. Families will be collaborating, but each clan is not able to collaborate with other clans. And so when you're thinking of groups that are organized in this way, you want to make sure that at every level, the selection pressure is distributed appropriately so that it generates collaboration within the group and also collaboration between groups. How do you do that? Well, practically speaking, it has to do with how I'll give you an easy example. So the way departments are organized in a college or university, right? How is it that individual faculty members are evaluated? Each faculty member is evaluated for his or her or their own performance. That puts selection pressure on the individual. On the other hand, if you evaluate each department, that would put selection pressure at the level of the department. And there are very different consequences. If the selection pressure is acting on the individual faculty member, then each faculty member has an incentive to, has really no incentive to collaborate with other faculty members. And you're going to get more selfishness. If an entire department is evaluated, every faculty member has an incentive to collaborate. You're going to get highly collaborative departments. The same phenomenon then goes, you know, when you think in terms of larger groups.
I see we have questions in the chat. So the first one is by Tyler Waltz. Does Tyler want to ask this question?
Sure. So my question, I was just sort of asking, are smaller groups more cohesive due to interpersonal communication relationships, understanding each other's strengths and weaknesses, and simply training together? People tend to care more in smaller groups, it may seem, just because they work well with each other, they know each other better, versus a company maybe where there's 100 other employees. To put this in a silly term, you may care more for someone's birthday with 6 people that you know very well versus a large company where you're wishing that person best wishes, but you really don't know them that well. It seems that group dynamic, when it's tighter, offers more cohesion.
Right. So Prosocial is based on the concern that we need collaboration not just within small groups, but at many different levels. You know, people, you know, the biggest problem facing humanity today is climate change. Small group collaboration, what is that going to do? We need collaboration at the level of humanity. So the idea here is that human beings evolved in small groups, And that is what, we are great at it. Human beings do immense cooperation within small groups. That's our, evolutionary heritage. Even there, there can be problems, but that is actually a strength. The issue is, how do you scale this at multiple levels so you can go all the way to the level of humanity as a whole collaborating with each other for the greater good of the planet? And so the way Prosocial is designed, it is independent of scale. The core design principles applied in a small group of, let's say, 6 people, they work to create a collaborative group, effective group. But then multiple groups who have implemented the core design principles inside themselves then need to apply the same principle at the next level up. So the groups can collaborate with each other. And then the next level up and the next level up until you get to a real United Nations where people can, different nations can actually collaborate. So a company, let's say, if you're talking about 100 people, it's not that it's even though the human strength is that we work very well in small groups. So what you do is 100 people, don't think of them as 100 people, think of them as 10 groups of 10 people each. And then we divide them into, we are already organized in, nested groups. That's how most institutions, organizations, societies are organized. So the collaboration has the same principles that work at a small level, then have to work at the level of groups. And then when you go higher, you have groups of groups. And then you have groups of groups of groups. And then you have groups of groups of groups of groups. But the same principles work.
We have Tess Varner. Is Tess there? Would you unmute and ask your 2 questions?
Oh, sure. I was just wondering if there were examples that you'd had experience with, or that you knew of, companies or groups that were embodying this well, just kind of what it looks like in practice, or if there are groups that we know of or anything like that. Thanks.
So you want to ask where are these principles coming from? They are coming from the research of Elinor Ostrom, who is known for basically proving that the tragedy of the commons is not inevitable. If you guys are familiar with that, the whole idea of individual self-interest just leading to exploitation and destroying natural resources. What Elinor Ostrom has shown through empirical research is that there have been communities, and there still are, around the world. She has created a huge database of those that have successfully managed their natural resources without the need of top-down regulation by government, without privatization, without free markets, only by following certain core design principles. Now, when these core design principles are not followed, you do get tragedy of the commons. Anytime you find a well-functioning commons, that's because the community there is following the core design principles. Now, her research is descriptive. She studied these communities, and she described that the more these principles are followed, you're going to see a better management of common pool resources. What Prosocial is, what happened when Elinor Ostrom and David Sloan Wilson and Stephen Hayes, when they got together and started sharing what they have learned, what emerged was this idea that these these principles that have been gleaned from observation can be generalized and approached as prescriptive to create collaborative groups. And they are, instead of these principles can be used for the management of common pool resources, yes. But in addition, anything, any goal, any task, any purpose can be treated as a commons. And so the same principles work. So when you say, are there groups? Well, thousands of them around the world. There's a database of those. Have I experienced any of those? No. When I think of groups that I've been part of, it's always that the group would score very high on 2 or 3 or 4 criteria, but I don't know, I have not experienced working in a group that that meets all 8 criteria.
Amina Chaudhry would like to ask a question about scale. So is she there?
I am. My question just was that when you had us do the exercise where we graded on the 8 qualities or principles, was there a grading system that you had that we were supposed to use to look at our score and see where we landed, or are you just having us calculate a percentage and self-assign a grade? Because I thought I heard you say A, B, C, and I don't know if I missed the scale.
Right. Yeah, I deliberately said A, B, and C instead of giving you a percentage or giving you a number. And that's because there are 2 reasons. One is that the exercise I made you do it's kind of subjective. And to get an actual, a proper scientific evaluation of a group, I would have every member of the group do the same exercise. And furthermore, there are other tests, the surveys, questionnaires, conversations. It's a whole process of determining where the group is, what are its strengths and what are its weaknesses. So what you did is really an imprecise and sort of a subjective sense of where a particular group is.
Okay, got it. Can I ask a follow-up question? I think
Sure.
Tess was the one who asked about examples of groups who are practicing or are prosocial. Have you heard of giving circles?
No, I have not.
Okay, so I am part of a giving circle, and I know when I was growing up, my parents practiced this form of, I don't know, what do you call it, community, but basically a group of 8-10 people get together, and what they do is every month, everybody contributes a certain dollar amount into a bucket of money. And so if there's 8 members in that giving circle, the period is 8 months long, and every month there is 8 times, let's say everybody puts in $100, that's $800 available every month to be gifted to one member to do something large with that money. So I don't know, pay off bills,
Right.
or whatever. And a lot of times these groups end up having to come up with their own rules of engagement and how they're going to engage with each other, how they're going to resolve conflict because money is involved. And I feel like a lot of what you are describing falls into like these groups function very much in pro-social ways. I just wanted to give that as an example. I know that there is a few giving circles. I think the Awesome Foundation in Fargo-Moorhead also functions a little bit like that. So that might be another example of groups that are somewhat, at least, pro-social.
Right. So I have heard of these back home in Pakistan growing up, although they were not called giving circles. What I would say is, if a group is organized for that specific purpose and nothing else, then the entire repertoire of pro-social principles or core design principles may not be equally applicable. So such a group does need conflict resolution and some procedures about what counts as fair and inclusive decision making and so on. And so to that extent, it can benefit, and it it can be called prosocial. The situations where all the full spectrum of CDPs are applicable are contexts where there is the group is trying to achieve a goal, a purpose, and it's a relatively long-term group where relationships have to be built over time. So the giving circles that you're describing, sometimes they run only for a few months and then they're disbanded.
Got it. That's helpful to hear.
So are there other questions before I ask this really hard one I have in mind?
Sure.
Okay, so one of the big things that we're struggling with in the US, of course, is the issues on racism and social justice. How would prosocial fit into that issue? So either one or both.
What do you mean either one or both?
So we clearly have a society that has severe problems with racism. And we have a long history of race being used against people, give them, harm them prejudicially, or give them preferential treatment, unfair advantage. So prosocial, I'm just trying to think, how would prosocial grapple with something this big of a question?
Right. So what prosocial would say is that you're going to have to divide and conquer. And you need what is a strong element in the human repertoire, which is small groups. You have to start at the level of small groups. So start with the neighborhood. Smaller, the better. And then gradually expand that. It's the same process. So for example, living in Moorhead, I would say, if I were to take that on, I would say, well, first thing I need to do is get people in my neighborhood together and build community from there. And then present a model of how a community can be organized, specifically in relation to racial justice, and then encourage other neighborhoods to do the same. That's how you proceed. You start from the bottom and then you expand. And if neighborhood groups can come together and you can have a citywide group, a larger group, the next step would be to have such organizations within cities, and then they can get together and do the same thing. You can't start from the highest possible, most complex level. The way prosocial works is that it takes advantage of the human evolutionary heritage of small group functioning. And it says we build multiple small groups and we link them together according to the same principles that we apply inside each group. And this can go on to higher levels. I want to address this question. There's a question from Anne. Since groups are affected by selection pressure, are there examples of how to influence beneficial selection pressure? Well, so the way this works is selection pressure is a double-edged sword. at any given level of a multi-level hierarchy of nested groups, selection pressure, to allow the emergence of an adaptive trait such as collaboration, you need to apply selection pressure at that level. But it is undermined by selection pressure acting at lower levels. So it's an issue of noticing what selection pressures are, how they are getting applied at different levels. So the example that I gave, selection, so in a college setting, you have departments. If the selection pressure at the level of the individual faculty member is greater than the selection pressure at the department level, you are going to get more selfish behavior and less collaboration. So you want to ensure that the selection pressure at the level of the department is higher, stronger than the selection pressure acting at the individual level. In other words, the way we evaluate and reward performance has to emphasize the department and not the individual faculty member. At the next level up, if you say, let's say there are divisions, you're going to have to do the same thing. If selection pressure at the level of departments is higher than the selection pressure at the level of the division, then you're going to get departments that compete against each other and are not willing to collaborate. So it's really a matter of balancing competition and collaboration. Competition at one level creates collaboration at the level below. So imagine sports teams, because sports teams are competing against each other. That's what creates collaboration inside each team. And so the challenge, there is no reason to get multiple sports teams to collaborate with each other. But if there was, and sometimes there is, when you have larger organizations or leagues, you're going to make sure that if different leagues are competing against each other, then there is incentive for different teams to collaborate with each other. And that the same process, once you understand it at one level, you know that the same process is going to work at all the levels.
There are two more questions for you.
When building a group, how can we incorporate this idea when hiring people? I really don't understand this. So let me give you two scenarios. Let's say you are already organized according to the CDPs, and you're a prosocial group. And now you want to add another person within that group. That's one scenario. The other is that you're not working in accordance with the principles of prosocial, and you want to become prosocial. So if you want to become prosocial, obviously the first place, the place to start is conversation. This is not something that can be implemented from top down. In other words, if a company president or CEO decides we are going to become prosocial, and from now on, this is what you do, that's not going to work. It's also against the basic principle of collaboration. People have to agree. People have to understand what they're getting into, what kind of change is required, and whether or not they're willing to do that. Prosocial works on the principle of willingness. In the same way, if a group agrees that we want to exercise the principles of prosocial, it can make progress in that direction. Now, if this group now wants to add another person from outside, that new person has to be obviously educated in how we do things here. And if there's a compatibility of culture and values, if the values are aligned, this new person will learn the culture of the prosocial group in no time. Now, if somebody is somebody brings a different set of values and they're not willing to change, then you're going to get some kind of friction.
I have to, it's actually time, I'm afraid to say. So I have to do my duties and bring this to a close. Would it be all right if people had questions to send you an email?
Yes, sure, definitely.
And we can supply that. This event was recorded, it will be edited and then posted on our YouTube site, and we can put Ahmed's email address with that, as well as perhaps a list of the books that he had listed so that people can take a look at that and use that as a resource. I want to thank him for a really interesting talk. I didn't know anything about this until now, and I actually was taking notes because I'm working on part of one of my chapters that I can use this in. So that was a great thing, and I thank you for that. But I also want to just remind folks that our next talk will be Ann Denton, May 4th at 12 p.m. Paradoxes Between Science and Morality. We'll, of course, send out notices on that. And just, I didn't mention this before, but on Monday of next week, the NPEI and the YWCA has a talk, and NDSU as well as a number of other folks, including Arts, Humanities, Social Sciences, are sponsoring a talk on unpacking and confronting linguistic racism by Kelly Elizabeth Wright from the University of Michigan. That is at noon. The meeting IDs and passcodes are available on the NPEI's websites. And we can also send it to you if you have any questions or comments. Our email address is ndsu.npei@ndsu.edu. And as always, I'm asking for folks, if they want to do presentations, just shoot me an email to that address and we should be good to go. But thank you. And I think we could do applause for Ahmed, although it does probably, mine's the only one that makes noise. So thank you very much. Have a wonderful day. Remember, it is spring. What's outside is only temporary. Be prosocial in your group. See y'all later. Bye.